Just because humanity now could ship goods long distances didn't mean that we did so very often. Post-Deepwater but pre-industrial shipments of grain from the Baltic region to continental Western Europe were hardly a regular affair. Even if Anglo-Dutch disputes didn't cut into deliveries, even if the Swedes didn't go all Viking on your ships, even if the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was having a rare good day, half of the end product cost typically still came from transport, with another quarter being racked up as storage fees. Grains produced in the interior, no matter how productive the land, tended to stay there. By the late 1700s, the American colonists come independent Americans did ship some grains across the Atlantic, but it was hardly a steady flow. Few things sucked more than making the grueling 6-week trip only to discover that England had had a bumper harvest. Yet even as ships became more efficient, the intersection of technology and geopolitics left the world divided. Geopolitics demanded that no empire buy food from any other. Even in the rare cases when shipping was thought reliable, the moods and appetites of opposing monarchs were most assuredly not. Geopolitics demanded that food shipments were rarely worth either the cost or the risk. But jade, pepper, cinnamon, porcelain, silk, and tobacco? Totes! It helped a lot that most luxury goods were not perishable. Tea was about as lowbrow a product there was to reliably make the cut. And even that was only because Europeans are weird. The luxuries trade was only considered global because of the distances involved. In reality, there was little trade among the empires. It was more accurately a series of closed systems sharing very few points of contact, and erratic contact at that. Cargoes were limited to the truly valuable, and to the sort of things you could ultimately do without. When you did see a transoceanic cargo vessel, it was a solid bet that disrupting its day would make yours. The Spanish called such disruptors English. The British called such disruptors French. Today, we call such disruptors pirates. As a result of this deliberate disconnectedness, neighbors were less for trading with and more for launching artillery shells into. The civilized world, to use the European lingo of the era, existed in a state of near permanent competition. Bringing order to such chaos was simply impossible. The superior naval power of the day, the Spanish in the 17th and early 18th centuries, or the English in the late 18th and 19th centuries, would attempt to convince everyone they were large and in charge, but this was before the age of radar and cruise missiles. There was a lot of ocean to patrol. Rivals had compelling strategic and economic reasons to muck things up. Any order would only hold within sight of their military vessels. The new technologies of the early industrial era, post-textiles, pre-steel ships, somewhat widened the range of goods that could be transported economically, which in turn carved out room for a new tier of country, the middlemen who brokered or ferried goods among opposing empires. It was risky business. The deals an empire categorized as brokering on Monday were often reclassified as double dealing by Thursday. The Dutch, every European's favorite middleman, became notorious for their massive booms when they carried European trade, and massive busts when the British or French or Germans decided they had had enough of the Dutch trading with the other side. The Americans learned this lesson early and often. Many of the early geopolitical nightmares for the young country centered on trade of the decidedly Dutch variety. America's first major strategic row, the Quasi-War of 1798 to 1800, centered on French seizures of neutral American shipping to Britain. The Brits made some popcorn for the coming fight and had the nerve to talk shit about France to the recently independent Americans, but they were ultimately disappointed when both sides backed down. Just 12 years later, the Americans found themselves again in the middle of a British-French war, their third if you include the American Revolution. This time around, France was run by Napoleon. The British were particularly aggressive in interdicting American ships they deemed blockade breakers, even impressing crews on American-flagged ships into the Royal Navy. The Brits were total tools in this period. They didn't recognize naturalized American citizenship, so anyone who was born in the colonies was fair game for impressment. Born in 1775 in Philadelphia, yo, you're still a British subject. Get in my navy. Yada yada stuff happened, things were said, triggers were pulled, torches were thrown, and before you knew it, the Brits were roasting marshmallows over the coals of the former White House. And the Canadians became forever unsure just how much they could trust the Yanks. And yet, it was stunning, shocking how much did not change. At the close of the pre-industrial era, most economies were still either self-contained or subjugated in one way or another, with the cities that enjoyed navigable rivers or safe coasts largely dominating. For while the economics and mechanics of overseas travel had improved remarkably over the centuries, overland travel had only seen occasional improvements. It wasn't that nothing had gotten better. There had been steady advances in horse breeding, nutrient-rich feeding, harnessing, and so on. Every bit of reach meant more access to resources to power industry, or access to new towns that could trade with the outside world. But unlike the thousand-fold improvements in movement by water, movement by land in 1820 looked an awful lot like it did for the Romans, just with, in many cases, worse roads. Even as recently as the time of the Oregon Trail, you would not be happy but instead thrilled should your ox-drawn cart manage to clock 15 miles a day. While the technological advances in things like horseshoes and steel axles did lay important groundwork for what would come, these technologies didn't fundamentally change how we moved either ourselves or our stuff. And they couldn't, and they wouldn't. That is until such time that a completely new technological suite boiled forth and changed everything.